Welcome all of you to the fifth Symposium, the BBB's Charity Effectiveness Symposium. I'm Claire Rosenzweig, President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau, and it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this program. We are literally sold out today. We're expecting every seat in the House to be taken by the time the program gets underway. So I would ask all of you to keep your things close, and let's make sure that we give room for everyone. As I like to start all of our programs, I have to start with a lot of thank yous, because programs like this don't just happen. Thank you to Baruch and our staff. Thank you very much for making this possible today. Because without Baruch, we would not have been able to pull this together this year, so thank you once again. Our huge thank you to our major co-sponsors, because again, without their help, we would not be able to do this. American Express, many thanks to Tim McClyman, who you'll see later on, and his colleagues, Richard Brown and Christine Ray. Bank of New York Mellon, a big thank you to a board member of ours, Patricia Sampson, and her colleague, Mark Castle. Emblem Health. Again, Valerie Reardon is one of our generous board members, and her colleague, Karen Chaikin, who is going to be joining us today. The New York Community Trust. We are truly grateful to our program committee's member, Pat Swan of the Trust. We deeply appreciate their support. Again, it's their way of supporting this program so we can make it possible for all of you to attend. And of course, again, Baruch, the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, School of Public Affairs. And again, this is the fourth time that they've hosted us, so thank you again to Baruch. We owe a great deal to our program committee. They worked closely with us to develop the content and helped bring together the distinguished speakers that you'll hear today. The program committee is made up of Ronna Brown from Philanthropy New York, Doug Bauer of the Clark Foundation, Pat Sampson and Mark Castle from Bank of New York Mellon, Jack Krauskopf from the Baruch College School of Public Affairs, Pat Swan from New York Community Trust, Miguel Bonilla from New York City Department of Youth and Community Development, Tim McClyman, Richard Brown, and Christine Ray from American Express. And again, we want to thank all of you for your help in putting together this content. 14 organizations supported the program, collaborating with us to make it known to all of you. And many of you in the audience today are here from those organizations. And again, I know the list is long, but I think each one of them deserves our recognition. The Association of Development Officers, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Greater New York Chapter, the Baruch College School of Public Affairs, the Foundation Center, Long Island Center for Nonprofit Leadership at Adelphi University, the New York Council of Nonprofits, New York Society of Association Executives, Nonprofit Coordinating Committee of New York, NewYorkCharities.org, Philanthropy New York, Staten Island Not-for-Profit Association, the United Way of New York City, Women in Development New York, and Young Nonprofit Professionals Network of New York City. It's a long list, but thanks to all of you. And a number of these groups have left their information out at the registration table, and I urge all of you, to take a look at what they have there for you. Finally, our staff, the BBB staff, Walter, Don, Mary, Luana Lewis, who is our Senior VP of Programs. She is amazing. She helped put this together. Susan McMillan there in the back of the room, and the rest of the staff here. Anything that you need, just give a holler, and they will see if they can help you. And now it's my pleasure to invite our host, David Birdsell, to the podium. David is the Dean and Professor of the Baruch School of Public Affairs. Dean Birdsell.
Thank you, Claire. Welcome, everyone, on behalf of the College, the School of Public Affairs, and the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management. It is a great pleasure to be partnering again with the Better Business Bureau, with Claire, Luana, and everybody at the organization to focus attention on yet another extraordinarily important series of questions for this sector. And there is no question as we look across this audience today and know that we have to have the Amtrak rules. Please make sure that your belongings are not in the seat beside you as the train will be packed. These are questions that really do resonate across the spectrum of organizations, individuals interested in philanthropy in the city and interested in the performance of nonprofit organizations. I do want to just ask a question, though, that I know that speakers are going to be addressing over the course of the day, and that is the last two words in the title of today's program, this notion of the new normal. Do we have right now a new normal? Let me just say, by God, I hope not. If this is the new normal, this is going to be a very grim place to be for a while. But it's very clear that we are in a period of transition. While I'm on the theme of being grim, I never thought that I would have the opportunity in introductory remarks to invoke Donald Rumsfeld. But I think that he gives us a useful way to understand this. We have the known knowns, we have the known unknowns, and we have the unknown unknowns. Right now, more is moving away from the known known category and into the bottom two brackets. We do know some things, however, which are likely not to be different in the relatively near future, including declining government support at virtually every level of government, including a strong emphasis on earned revenue, including the need for new sources, new philanthropy, not old philanthropy, new philanthropy to patch gaps that are going to continue to emerge as fissures open as we restructure our operations. I like to believe that there are many answers that will invigorate the sector, and I know that one of the reasons that you are here today is because you believe that too, and all of our speakers do, and they're going to be talking to you about some of the more sophisticated thinking that we have going forward with this new environment. We are thrilled that you're here. We are thrilled again to be working with the Better Business Bureau and all of you, and look forward to a terrific day. Claire?
Thank you. You know, as we were putting this program together, again, for another year, we were saying, again, to your point, this new normal. You know, there's a lot being said about it, but why is the Better Business Bureau doing a program on this? Well, you know, back in 2002, the BBB launched its updated standards for charity accountability, and in 2003, we rolled them out here in the New York area. Two of those standards have to do with effectiveness. They say basically that an organization should evaluate their effectiveness and at least every 2 years, and they should tell their board about it. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you'd be amazed. I mean, it's just to be able to focus on effectiveness. Some people never used to think about that to the degree that they do now. And effectiveness is one thing, but of course, there's the issue of impact, which we're all hearing about as well. So when we said let's do this program, we wanted to do it with that focus of let's focus on what it takes to be an effective organization and why. You know, this program is called Mastering the New Normal, and again, we have seen that phrase bantered about quite a bit. So we're talking about the new normal for you now, and this now is literally a snapshot in time, because it's going to evolve, it's going to change, and certainly we hope it's going to change for the better. But you have to deal with it, this new normal, whatever it is for you now, we have to deal with it. And, you know, as organizations, running your organization effectively has a lot of different implications. And so today we really wanted to focus on what role does leadership play? You know, it's one thing to say, be effective. Well, what does that mean? And we wanted to have a discussion about what role leadership plays. And the second thing we wanted to do was to have a discussion about what role mission-focused, being mission-focused has to do. What does it mean when you wrap all your programs and focus on your mission? How does that all turn out? And how does that impact effectiveness? So in today's program, we're going to be identifying and building on core strengths, engaging and motivating people in fresh ways, learning how focusing on mission can help us to communicate better, improve the bottom line, and again, what role does leadership play in all of this? So it's going to be an interesting conversation. We literally have the best people talking about it for you to hopefully weed out and take home and use. So a couple of housekeeping notes. There was no easy bridge into this. the housekeeping notes. You have index cards in your packets. As the speakers are speaking, please, when you think of a question, write it down. We'll have staff walking through and collecting those cards. We've invited Jack Krauskopf to moderate the questions for our first panel, and you'll also find an evaluation form in your packets. We actually listen to you. This year, for instance, after the session is over, there's going to be the 2 networking rooms that some of you who have been here before, we've done separate sessions in those. This year we're going to have one strictly for your networking because you asked for it, and the second room is going to be focused on our charity effectiveness standards for those of you who have an interest in learning more or if you have questions about it. So now, I would like to ask Program Committee member Ronna Brown, who is president of Philanthropy New York, to introduce our keynote speaker, who's Doug Bauer of the Clark Foundation. Doug, too, is a committee member, and he was also just recently chairman of our Wise Giving Alliance. So with that, Ronna Brown.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks to the Better Business Bureau for putting on this program and for all of the co-sponsors who worked so hard to put it together. It's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce Doug Bauer, who, as most of you know, is the executive director of the Clark Foundation. I have about 120 seconds to tell you everything you need to know about Doug, so that when you hear him, you can then place his remarks in context. So clearly I'm not going to quite manage that. You're just going to get a sprinkling of his background and a little bit of understanding the kind of thinking he's been doing. Doug, prior to being the executive director of the Clark Foundation, held a series of different positions, very senior positions, at corporate giving programs such as Goldman Sachs, SmithKline Beecham, private foundations like the Pew Charitable Trust, and most recently, prior to the Clark Foundation, was the senior vice president at the Rockefeller Philanthropic Advisors. What's important to know is that throughout Doug's history, he has been, I guess we would say, a strategic thinker and an author, and he has been regularly encouraging all of us in the sector, both funders and nonprofits alike, to think freshly about the problems that we have faced historically. An example of that is that Doug was part of the first group of funders who really started thinking seriously about mission-related investing, which is something where, as opposed to looking only at the $40 billion that foundations give in grants every year, that he encouraged the sector as part of a group of early adopters to think about the $300 billion that foundations had in endowments and how they could use that money more effectively. A very important conversation. Similarly, over this last year and a half since Doug has been at the Clark Foundation, he has been talking and thinking about the crisis that we are all facing, really sooner than many of us wanted to think about it or hear about it. He's been encouraging us and articulating the issues as a spokesperson for this sector, to think about how we are going to cope with the situation we are in and not hide behind the hope that it's simply going to go away. In short, Doug has been one of those funders that those of us in nonprofits like to say, he gets it, he understands where we're coming from. And that's one of the reasons that I am delighted that Doug is on my board at Philanthropy New York. The other reason is because he brings some really critical diversity to my board. Now, looking at Doug, you might think, what is she talking about? Well, I have a very East Coast board, and Doug is the only member of my board who was ever an on-air radio personality for a country western station in Michigan. So think about that as you listen to Doug. It's my pleasure to introduce him.
Thanks for bringing up that factoid, Rana. Good morning, everybody. All right. First of all, I just want to say I can keep a job. The thing in the field of philanthropy is it's very flat, so to move up, you got to move out, and I've done that a couple of times, but also because I've been provided some wonderful opportunities over the years to do different jobs, and have enjoyed every one of them. Couple of things. First of all, I want to thank Rana for that lovely introduction, and also want to acknowledge Rana and I now have worked together for almost 15 years. We first met on the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance board, and now I've had the pleasure of working with her as the CEO and president of Philanthropy New York. And I just want to acknowledge that Rana's done a terrific job at Philanthropy New York, and she's really been a great steward and a great leader, and I just want to acknowledge that. So thank you, Rana. Also, I want to acknowledge Bennett Weiner, who doesn't get enough recognition. Bennett is the Chief Operating Officer of the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance, which is the national organization that does the charity standards. And I had the pleasure of being, chair for 5 years of the Wise Giving Alliance. But it's really Bennett who really maintains a high level of quality and is really the person that makes sure that those standards are the best that they can be. And I really want to acknowledge Bennett's hard work for the entire sector and the entire country. So thank you, Bennett. Okay, so I want to thank Claire and Luana, who's probably running, there's Luana, for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning. When Luana called me a few months ago and asked me if I would do this, and I said okay, and she said, great, what are you going to talk about? That was a little harder back in October when she talked to me about this, but I had been reading a couple of articles by economists and economic analysts that were discussing the concept of the new normal, which was coined by PIMCO's Mohammed El-Arian in his new book called, at the time, When Markets Collide. Now, the book talks about the shift of economic growth away from the United States and to the emerging markets, and how that shift would be disruptive in the short term, but ultimately a good thing for the markets and the world. Now, you'll be very happy to know that is not, I repeat, not what I'm going to talk about this morning. I have no skill in that whatsoever. But reading these articles in the fall got me to think about, well, what is the new normal for the New York City nonprofit sector? And more specifically, what are the real needs, the now needs, if you will, for the nonprofit new normal? And so I shared this idea with Luana, and she said, terrific. And I said, okay, now I have to think about it. So today, my comments are based on my reflections, interactions, and most important, my listening to the some 130 grantees of the Clark Foundation these last 20 months. Many of them are in the audience here today, and it has been a pleasure, and I mean that, a real pleasure getting to know them, their programs, and the environments in which they operate. To a person, they are compassionate, tenacious leaders, and I've learned much from them. Now, as we wrap up the first 2 months of 2011 and reflect on what has happened to our grantees and large parts of the nonprofit sector economically and politically these last 2 years, one should not be depressed, but rather impressed, and I mean that, yes, impressed, because despite a slow recovering economy characterized by incremental growth and cuts in public and private funding, aka this new nonprofit new normal, nonprofits providing vital services to low-income families and underserved communities, broadly speaking, have demonstrated resiliency and remained steadfast. Now, nevertheless, here in New York City and New York State, one does wonder just how many more funding cuts and slow-paying, performance-based contracts nonprofits can continue to absorb or manage. The reality here in the Empire State is indeed sobering. And according to the Fiscal Policy Institute, we can expect budget gaps in fiscal years 2012, 13, and 2014 of $10, $14, and $17 billion, respectively. That $10 billion figure that we're currently batting around in Albany represents about 15% of the state budget. Now, it is true that Mayor Bloomberg had some better news to report last Thursday about increased business and property tax revenue. His 2012 budget, according to the New York Times, still contains the real possibility of 100 senior centers closing, more than 6,000 teachers being laid off, and 17,000 child care slots being eliminated. But this budget also expects that the state will provide some $600 million that it owes, I underscore owes, for education and other programs. Now, sadly, this news is no different in other states and cities. According to the Center on Budget Policies and Priorities, one of my favorite think tanks, 44 of the 50 states face budget gaps, with New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and California in the deepest trouble. Now, that is a cause of concern, as 25% of the U.S. population lives in those 4 states, and those 4 states are also home to some of the deepest urban poverty. And as our colleagues at the Robin Hood Foundation constantly remind us, there are 1.9 million individuals in New York City living at or below the federal poverty line, a figure that goes to 3 million when you go roughly about 200% above the poverty line and include families of 4 living on just under $35,000 a year in this community. Now, by any estimation, this fiscal and by extension political crisis has little upside for the third sector and will only further test the stamina of staff, executives, and boards of well-managed nonprofits on the front lines of poverty and other crucial issues. And I won't even attempt to touch on the situation in Washington right now, as it is fluid, but it is deeply troubling and bears the attention of everyone in this room. So, what then is our response, both philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, to the new normal? In my remaining time, I'd like to suggest 4 things that foundations can do and 4 things that nonprofits can do in response to this current environment. I've been relieved so far that we haven't seen calls for philanthropic dollars to make up gaps created as a result of the major shortfall of public dollars. The total giving in 2010, approximately, of Philanthropy New York's 280 members is about $3.72 billion. Now, that is a significant figure, but much of that is provided by New York City-based foundations like Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and George Soros's Open Society Institute. And those foundations and their philanthropy are international and national in scope. And as a result, what is left from foundations like Clark and others, there's not nearly enough to fill the huge holes in the state or city's budget. But the traditional role of philanthropic dollars in the nonprofit sector has been and continues to be to accelerate ideas, prove models that work, and scale programs that are effective. So the grant dollars we allocate as a field are not to be used to fill gaps created by reduced public funding. But in this time of uncertainty, I think we can be more thoughtful about how we target grants and be fully cognizant of the reality that all of you are trying to operate in and cope with. As a result, I would suggest recalibrating our grant making for the short term. And with that in mind, and for maximum impact in real time, I would suggest 4 things to do in these 4 tactical areas. Number 1, general operating support. I don't feel I need to explain. Thank you very much. No, it's always great. It's always great that that's an applause line. Only in the nonprofit sector. I don't feel I need to explain in the audience the need for general operating support, but I do feel that to properly sustain nonprofits that are crucial to maintaining the social safety net or delivering other necessary services or programs, we must provide them general operating funds. Grant dollars that come with the greatest flexibility are the dollars that are needed most in the current environment and help cover the costs of less sexy but vital budget line items like salaries, benefits, rent, insurance, and utilities. Number 2, technical assistance. Another less sexy item, but working smarter in the new normal is not so much a luxury as it is a necessity. If funders offer grantees full access to sound advice and management training, nonprofits will have a better chance of succeeding in the new normal. It is important to emphasize that size or influence will not save an organization in this environment. Survival will depend on how a grantee efficiently deploys resources and effectively executes appropriate strategies and tactics. Number 3, access to working capital. In the new normal, cash is truly king, but access to capital is another thing entirely. Currently, banks are understandably nervous about extending lines of credit in an environment of severely constrained public and private financing for nonprofits. However, using well-regarded financial intermediaries like the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I think Kristen Giantris is here from the Nonprofit Finance Fund this morning, private foundations of all sizes can establish pools of working capital for their grantees and can do so through the use of program-related investments. Number 4, advocacy. The voices of the nonprofit and of the people they serve cannot be ignored in this time of limited resources. Nonprofit leaders need to respond with even-handed advocacy fueled by facts and driven by data. Adopting the usual behavior of being shy or muted in the new normal will most likely result in further reductions in public funding. Enhanced advocacy will go a long way in defending current level support and hopefully avoiding further cuts. Now, while these 4 areas appear straightforward, easy to embrace, practical to implement, few foundations employ them as part of their grant-making strategy. Fortunately, these 4 tactics are ones that can be deployed quickly and effectively. And I would argue the quicker, the better, because in the nonprofit new normal, money, good counsel, and advocacy are not the only precious resources. So too is time. And how much time our nonprofit partners, you, will have to react to the various external forces now in play is something these 4 philanthropic tactics can definitely and positively influence for the better. Along with the 4 things foundations and their staffs and boards can consider to be fully responsive in this current environment, what are the 4 things nonprofits can do to make sure they are going to move forward in the new normal? Now, based on what we've observed, and the current best practices of our grantees at the Clark Foundation, let me suggest the following. Number 1, brutal honesty. I have to say I've been amazed at some organizations who believe that in this current environment they can grow their way out of a problem or difficult circumstances. That's not to say you can't do it, but I really believe that is pretty hard to do in the new normal. And it leads me to suggest that you need to be clear and honest with yourself, your staff, and your board about what really is possible or viable. You need to be honest about where revenue is coming from, how you monitor or control spending, how you comply with contracts, and what is really going on in the marketplace. You also need to be clear about your competitors or your peer organizations. What are they doing? Are they performing better than your organization in similar programs? If they are, why? Speaking of your competitors or peers, it leads me to suggest a second item to consider, and that would be exploring mergers, alliances, and/or collaborations. I don't suggest this out of the belief that there are too many nonprofits out there. I say this because I worry there is not going to be, in the near term, a mix of public and private funding that can sustain all of you that are out there. It then triggers the question whether like-minded groups who share a common mission, a client base, a geography, should not explore ways of working together and sharing costs. Now, mergers are hard. I know this because I've been through one personally when I worked in the corporate sector. And there's a few of my corporate friends out there who know what I'm talking about. There's not a worse feeling professionally than knowing your company is a target or a mediocre performer and therefore becomes prey. Mergers in the nonprofit sector are twice as hard, in my estimation, because there's no share price to settle on and little to no way for a departing executive director or CEO to leave with the kind of golden parachute that one receives in the private sector. But mergers may not be the answer. What may work better is an alliance or a collaboration. It may revolve around a savings in backroom or administrative costs, bulk buying, or the better deployment of programs in a neighborhood. I'm a big fan of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and last spring they published an article by David Lipiana entitled Merging Wisely. And the gist of the article is that there are a number of ways that nonprofits can work together and that don't necessarily involve a time-consuming and energy-consuming merger. And I would encourage you to seek it out and see if there is some of what Lipiana suggests is applicable to your organization and its operating reality. And by the way, I checked, you can download it for free off their website. So there you go. And as much as I believe nonprofits need to thoroughly explore this merger, alliance, collaboration issue in the new normal, I also believe that foundations should not trigger these explorations. The fact of the matter is there are, because of the grantee-grantor dynamic, nuances and subtleties that we are going to miss or not be aware of. It's better if any attempts at merging or collaborating come from sincere interest from both parties rather than be forced by a foundation or a corporate giving program. The last thing that I will say about this topic is that I'm encouraged by the current efforts such as the one by United Neighborhood Houses. Nancy is here in the audience. Where's Nancy? There you are. Where they are fostering discussion in 5 geographic clusters of their members to explore ways to share costs and or collaborate on programs. And indeed, the work of UNH leads me to my third suggestion. We really need a blueprint. The advocacy currently being done in Albany and in City Hall, now and over the next few months, by the sector is what it should be, fighting budget cuts and sustaining funding where and when we can. And the Human Services Council has just launched a campaign called Who Cares? I Do, and it is something that everyone should get behind on a statewide basis. And at the city level, United Neighborhood Houses is doing Don't Cut the Core. That's their campaign, and it's a vehicle that helps brand the battle you're all waging to stave off budget reductions and defend programs. But I would submit that we need to do a bit more, and here's what I'm thinking. We need to come up with the social safety net we truly need and that will provide the essential services and programs. After this current public funding battle, we, the funders and the providers, need to take a step back and think about and then construct a cost-effective, efficient, and caring social safety net in New York City and for the rest of the 21st century. Everyone in this room has more knowledge than most anybody else in the public or private sector about what really works when it comes to helping people in poverty and then hopefully keeping them out of poverty, or how to educate children, or define hard-to-employ people jobs and keep them employed. It would be great to unleash the talent in this room to come up with the new and improved social safety net, one crafted by the people who have made it work every day. If we don't come up with a viable working model, then we will continue in this endless cycle of saying every year, don't cut us, please don't cut us. I was interested in reading in what I believe was The Economist when Jerry Brown's standard response is when people come up to him in California and say, please don't cut my program. He then says, well, if I don't cut you, then please suggest who do I cut? My point is that this is a no-win discussion. It becomes a different discussion if we move forward with a social safety net that we know will work and will be effective and can be supported by an appropriate amount of public subsidy, fueled by private philanthropy. I recognize that this is what Jim Collins calls a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. But if we want to shift the discussion and have some control over our destiny, then we need to start coming up with viable alternatives that will work in the new normal and beyond. My final suggestion for my nonprofit colleagues is to make sure your boards are fully engaged. As part of our site visits at the Clark Foundation, we always request whether a board member can be part of that discussion. And I'm happy to say that almost all the time a board member attends. It always adds so much to the conversation as the board member provides his or her perspective to what the executive director is saying. And of course, it's always interesting to see if they align. I've also been impressed at how engaged boards are with the new normal and what it means for the nonprofit they represent and govern. Because many of them are from the private sector, many of them have seen firsthand how devastating the new normal has been to the business climate. And as a result, their involvement is demonstrated not only by attending board meetings and writing a check, but things like this. A board chair of a large settlement house we fund reviewing cash flow on a weekly basis, not out of weakness, but out of a desire to be an effective fiduciary. A board member contacting and visiting with legislators or the mayor because he knows them personally. A board member attracting high-end pro bono consulting help through a business relationship. When I look back on the various nonprofits that have hit the skids, in good times and bad, by the way, one factor in that demise of the nonprofit was the board not doing its job. That is a dynamic no nonprofit can ill afford, especially in the new normal. As I wrap up my comments this morning, I hope I've provided some food for thought and some things to think about for the rest of the morning and maybe perhaps the rest of the year. I don't have to tell you that this is as dynamic and fluid an operating environment that the nonprofit sector has experienced in recent memory. And I've been doing this work for almost 23 years. And I could be wrong, but I think what happens in the next 2 years will shape what happens in the next 10 to 20. We are, as I stated a moment ago, rethinking the social safety net, or perhaps rewriting the social contract in this country. Really, since the Reagan years, we've had a debate about what the role of government is in America. And in that time, we've come to rely on nonprofits to carry out many services and programs that once were the purview of federal, state, and local government. With the public fiscal crisis we are having here in New York State and around the country, what we do to help the less fortunate will be restructured. The big question is, will we have a role, a serious role, to play in this huge and important discussion? If we are to have the discussion, then I would suggest the 8 items I've described this morning for foundations and nonprofits will hopefully be the ingredients that will help position all of you in success for the short and long run. I want to close with 2 thoughts, and they're kind of divergent. The first comes from Henry A. Wallace. Anybody know who Henry A. Wallace is? Any show of hands? All right, way to go, Michael. Very good, Nancy. Okay. I'm reading his biography right now, and it's entitled American Dreamer. Now, Wallace was vice president, one of FDR's 3 vice presidents. He was vice president during his 3rd term and secretary of agriculture in FDR's first 2 terms. Much of the New Deal flowed through the Department of Agriculture. You have to remember back in the 1930s, most of this country and its population was indeed still rural. Now, Wallace was pragmatic, progressive, and religious. And Wallace was known for bringing many parties together to hammer out policies that would put farmers back on their feet, and he did it quite successfully. He said the following in a speech in December of 1933 to the Federal Council of Churches, and I quote, "The world is one world, and men must learn to live for all mankind and not for themselves alone. When cooperation becomes a living reality, in the spiritual sense of the term, when we have defined certain broad objectives which we all want to attain, we can then feel the significance of the forces at work not merely in our own lives, not merely in our own class, not merely in our own nation, but in the world as a whole. Then the vision of Isaiah and the insight of Christ will be on their way to realization. What was necessary," said Wallace, "was a declaration of interdependence, a recognition of our essential unity and our absolute reliance upon one another." Now, my final thought is a story about former Senator Bill Bradley. And I just want to say, I have a lot of favorite public servants, past and present. Bill Bradley is one of them. And political pundit Chris Matthews attributes this story to Al Gore, and it's a brief parable about power and resources. So Senator Bradley was asked to give a speech at one of those crazy annual dinners that we all do. And he showed up early because he had to get his thoughts together and make some notes. So he's sitting down here, and it's way before anybody shows up. And a waiter comes by, and he's putting a roll and a pat of butter on each of the plates. Now, Bradley didn't have any lunch, so he stops the waiter, and he says, "If you don't mind, I'd love another roll and another pat of butter." And the waiter says, "I'm sorry, it's 1 roll and 1 pat of butter per setting." Senator Bradley goes, "I'm sorry, I don't think you know who I am. I'm Senator Bill Bradley, used to play for the Knicks, went to Princeton, Rhodes Scholar. I think I get another roll and a pat of butter." And the waiter says, "I'm sorry, Senator, I don't think you know who I am." And Senator Bradley goes, "No, I don't actually." He goes, "I'm the guy with the roll and the butter." And walks away. Now, why did I tell you that story? Well, my colleagues, we are the waiter with the rolls and butter. We do have power, we do have resources, and we do have a role to play in all of this. And as we think about the solutions to the various problems and issues all of you tackle every day, the solutions are to be found within the work you do day in and day out. You know it works, you know it doesn't work. You know how to be effective and cost efficient. You know how to measure and identify outcomes. And most of all, you care. The current job of my colleagues in the world of philanthropy is to sustain your work right now and to strengthen your work as best we can. Your job in the new normal is not only to keep helping, supporting those who need help the most, but to begin to build together, as Henry Wallace would say, a new and rational reality we really need and must have in order to make sure the 2 to 3 million people in poverty or on the edge of it in this great city of ours are not to be left behind. Thank you. You bet. You want to take some questions? Or?
Yes.
Okay, get that out of the way.
Now, Jack Krauskopf, who's a distinguished lecturer from the Baruch School of Public Affairs, will moderate some questions for Doug.
I may not be 6'5", but you haven't seen my jump shot yet. Let's start with the first one we've got. Reality of deficits equal huge cuts in social services. How should individual nonprofits think about influencing this in a way that is not competitive between silos, aging and childcare?
That's a very good question. And I think people like Nancy and Anthony at United Neighborhood Houses have thought about this a lot. I think it's through the power of collaboration and coalitions. I'm sorry, Nancy, to keep putting you in the spotlight, but I've thought a lot about a meeting that Nancy and I had about a week ago with my colleague Nancy Garrido. And it was a very good conversation, which lasted close to 2.5 hours. And one thing that Nancy and Anthony Ing, am I pronouncing that right, Nancy?
Yeah.
Yes. Anthony's the director of public policy for UNH. Pulled out a scorecard, which of course warmed the funders' heart to have a scorecard. But, Anthony brought out the list of accomplishments, really the wins and losses in the advocacy that UNH had done over the previous year. And I think the thing that was actually reassuring was, I haven't added it up, but, in baseball terms, it was a pretty good hitting average. Not everything was lost. And in fact, quite a bit was either sustained or not cut as much. And it's sad that we have to celebrate things like not cutting as much. But the mere fact of the matter was that UNH had done a very effective job in representing the interests of their membership. And I think what I'm reassured by, as we've talked with the various groups that are out there advocating on your behalf, is that people like the Human Services Council, like UNH and PCC, have done a good job. And I think by working together, we do an effective job of doing that. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be interacting with your legislators, your council people, on an individual basis. They need to understand within their district what it means if you sustain a cut that you're going to receive as a result of a larger picture. They need to understand what that means. If you're up in Queens, at Queens Community House with Irma, and she loses daycare slots. It's important for the council people and the legislators to understand that. So I think it's working jointly through the coalition and umbrella groups that you have, as well as advocating at the council district level or the legislative district level.
So the next one goes to one of the tough challenges you gave to the nonprofits. How would you envision the creation of a blueprint for a safety net? Coalition working in each social services field, convening of philanthropic leaders and social service nonprofit leaders, etc. What's the mechanism, I guess is the question.
Now, Jack, this is your area, not mine. I don't have the answer to that question. It's not going to be a cogent one. Other than to say I've started to talk with different people about this. There are other funders that are interested in this issue. Ron and I have certainly talked about it at Philanthropy New York. I'm very interested in trying to encourage that conversation. It is going to be a group of people. It has to be the nonprofit leadership and leadership from the philanthropic community and people like Jack and others who have had tremendous experience in the public sector that we can benefit from. So it's going to be a conversation and a dialogue. The only thing that I would encourage is that it be an efficient one so that we can have something pulled together. I think the other thing that we also need, just to complicate matters further, is probably a blueprint for the next mayor. Mayor Bloomberg, who, net has been a positive influence in the work that we do. I know it's hard to say that in this current environment, but it's true. And he is gone in 2.5 years. What will the next mayor want? What will he or she want to do? What will they try and implement? It's important that we try and influence that and start to provide them some ideas about what we think the social safety net should be.
And what should be done about the many projects that are on the boards right now that aren't going to be finished by the time you leave.
I'd be curious, Jack, for your response to that.
I'm not sure I know what a mechanism is. I think the problem is probably if you take the collective of the agencies that are doing the safety net, they think that they're doing the safety net. And anything else is a subtraction. And that's what's, I think, hard to figure out. Is there really something that's being done that isn't needed as we go into the future?
Right.
So the next one goes to the foundation side of your advice.
Sure.
What is being done to encourage foundations to open their minds and support general operating expenses?
What, they're not doing it? Well, first of all, I think some have done it, so that's encouraging. Not probably as many as you would like to see. I think this is something that happens through formal and informal discussions, through mechanisms like Philanthropy New York and elsewhere. I think a lot of the foundation leadership understands the environment we're in. They know that they can, and I should say this, let me back up for a second. the foundation community the last 2 years has been through some very difficult times. And I know that's hard for some people to hear, but that is true. I mean, I've been in this field 23 years, and I've never seen what has happened in the last two. People getting laid off, foundations shutting down, etc. It's not been fun. They lost, on average, 27% of their endowments. So, and if you've got really, really, really good investment people, you're maybe back to where you were before the downfall in the fall of 2008. So the foundations are not out of the woods yet either. I think they understand that they have to be responsive in this environment, and there are folks that have been. I mean, I applaud the New York Community Trust with the emergency money that they've kicked out the last couple of years. No question that's been important. I'm happy to say that 77% of our grants are general operating support grants on an average size of $127,000 a grant. The best we can do is try and share that kind of knowledge, and one way that we did that is I did put an op-ed in the Chronicle, of Philanthropy, this current issue that talks about these ideas.
A question about how to talk to the board if they push for growth of the budget during these times. How do you talk to reality?
I think you gotta, I know this is hard, but you have to push back on the board. I mean, I have to say that, and when I made that comment in the speech, I'm happy to say that the overwhelming majority of the Clark grantees have not been preaching growth. Some have, and for legitimate reasons, but most have not. And I think they understand, and their boards understand, that this is a period of really, how do we sustain ourselves and make sure we can get through this current crisis, however long it lasts, and then figure out what the new reality is going to be. But I think boards that are not owning up to really taking true responsibility for the stewardship of their organization, and that may mean increased fundraising, it may mean a whole lot of other things, but they've got to acknowledge that that's their role and their responsibility. And if they are pushing the growth, then I think the ED really has to push back and ask why they're asking that question. And frankly, I would turn it around and say, what would you, if you were in my shoes, what would you be doing if this was your business and you're the CEO? You have, and maybe the growth opportunities are limited. Tell me what you would do in this current situation. But boards that are pushing that right now, I'd be very, very leery of.
Here's one about changes on the government side of funding. Please address the impact of elimination of discretionary funding for service for Senate and Assembly members.
Yeah, it's that's a tough one. We see it everywhere in our grantee community, and it's it's a loss of 50,000 here or 25,000 there, or we do a lot of funding upstate where the Clark family is from originally, and Glimmerglass Opera just lost $100,000, and so it's this kind of nickel and dime, but it's important stuff. It plugs those budget gaps. They tend to be general operating support dollars. It doesn't look like that money's coming back anytime soon. I'm looking at Doug Bauer, who's the CEO of NICON, New York Council of Nonprofits. Is it coming back anytime soon, Doug? No. Okay. So, that's another thing that we have to be cognizant of. I don't think in this current environment we can really expect that from legislators, unfortunately. And they're not happy about it either. We've talked to a few of them, and they understand how important it is. It's not a position they want to be in, but they're actually being responsible about the issue.
Back to the foundation side, funders to a large extent are partly responsible for the challenges nonprofits are facing. The hoops nonprofits must jump through to get funding don't make sense in these times. What are you doing to reduce the administrative burden on nonprofits?
Pass.
Put that one out of order.
There are things that I think the field has tried to do. We've got the common grant application form at Philanthropy New York, so at least we try to create in a uniform way, the way that you and others apply to foundations. There's no question that there are certain foundations in this community that demand a higher level of reporting, and that I know is troublesome to folks. However, I also understand where they're coming from. unfortunately, and this may not be an answer you're going to be liking, you know, we have had quite a debate in the field of philanthropy for the last 20 years about outcomes and measurement and evaluation. And frankly, those forces have won. It's just become very clear that boards of foundations, big and small, are very interested in the return on the investment they're making in a nonprofit. And they certainly see it that way. And I'm speaking here broadly, but I think it's really kind of what's permeated the foundation community. And that is here. And that does require some additional reporting on your part. However, I think net-net it has been a good thing for the community. I think it's very important that you are absolutely clear on what results you are delivering. The thing that I think is important is to make sure that you are describing results in the terms that you are comfortable with and that it's not being foisted upon you. Now that's broader than the question, Jack, but that's where I think a lot of the hoops are coming from these days, is not so much the how do you apply, but what you have to report back on. And there are different models out there. But I think that's just part of what is the reality right now. I'm not sure how we can minimize it, but I think it is an important aspect of what is going on in philanthropy. And I think it's important that we're clear about results. And I think what's been interesting, we've obviously been a big proponent of outcomes thinking. We have supported well over 75 of our grantees going through outcomes training at the Rensselaerville Institute. I think it has made those nonprofits better nonprofits. They are very clear about what they get done and why, and in some cases how much it costs. That makes them far more competitive in the current reality that we're in.
Here's one that may be asking you for legal and technical advice that you may or may not want to give. Some nonprofit organizations, not foundations, have restricted endowments. Staff are being let go, programs are being dropped, etc., because the endowment can't be touched. Any suggestions?
That is technical. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I don't have a real response other than I think that is illegal and it's an accounting question, fiduciary question, and it's one that would have to be wrestled with by the board with getting very, very good advice from both attorneys and your auditor to find out what is possible. That would be an unfortunate situation.
A couple are asking about mission. What do you see as mission areas which the government has abandoned, and how can nonprofit sector address them? Do you think there will be a shift in what is seen as responsibility of government and what is seen as responsibility of the private sector?
That's a good question. Those are both good questions. Look, I think this is it's fascinating what I think is going on right now. And if I step back from it as one who's been a political junkie all his life, and also committed to the nonprofit sector, it's fascinating the forces at play. Look, and again, Jack is more of an expert. He lived this, working in city government, so I'd like you to chime in on this. But I think, look, we have outsourced a lot of what government used to do, and we've outsourced it through the nonprofit sector. We are now having, I think, a debate about what that outsourcing is going to be, at what level, and what capacity. The complicating factor in all of this is I don't think we really know what the balance really needs to be. And that is a real, I think, issue in all of this. I think the other thing, and it was interesting, I remember a discussion we had at Philanthropy New York last May with a high-placed government official in Albany, whose name I will not mention. It was an off-the-record conversation. But this person said, you have to understand that the debate in Albany is about opposing forces. In many cases, it's business versus labor. Common good is not in that discussion. You're the common good. That is something we need to think about. Because that then introduces, well, then what do we want the nonprofits to do? What do we really see their role to be? What services do we really want them to be providing out there in the community? But it is going to require some kind of public subsidy for all of you to do your jobs and do it effectively. That is a reality. I think what is being debated right now is how much is that going to be, and can you live with it? And can we still maintain some kind of safety net out there? But I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, I think what we have, and everybody would agree, is a joint government, nonprofit, human services, arts and culture, healthcare, et cetera, system. And we have to regard it that way when it comes to public policy making and involve the nonprofit sector, including foundations as well as the service delivery organization, in the tough planning decisions and not have government issue fiats. Now, I'm not saying that's always what government does, but I'm not sure it regards the system as a jointly managed system, which it really is these days. One last question, if Luana will let me.
Yeah, one more.
How can we interest corporations with significant resources to direct more to the basic community needs and less to strategic marketing philanthropy?
Tim, you want to know?
Next panel.
Well, first of all, it's a leading question. First of all, I don't think my impression, first of all, having been a corporate grant maker, and now obviously working with and observing corporate grant makers, I don't think, it's not an either or. I think there's a lot of good companies, and I would include American Express in this, and I'm not saying that just because Tim and Richard are here, that do both, all right? And look, I think, corporate philanthropy is one thing, where cause-related marketing is appropriate and effective. I think that's useful. And I think the other thing that we have to really think about is where you can embed social responsibility into their business, okay? You may not like Walmart, but let me tell you something. After everything that Walmart has been through over the last few years and the criticism they have received, they have looked long and hard at their business practices and have incorporated a lot of very good business thinking about how to make society better. They've reduced their waste within their business process tremendously. I'll tell you one thing that I think is very exciting that Walmart recently announced, is that they're going to provide, and this is especially important for upstate New York and the markets that they serve in the Northeast Corridor, is that they've decided to make the produce that they're going to sell is going to be local produce. That is a huge, huge deal for local farmers, all right? They could continue to, get it from Spain and Chile and wherever you need to get it because that's where you get it and, they figured that all out. But they're going to do the best they can to try and make sure that local farmers are part of their sourcing process. And that's important when you realize, let me ask you this question. On out of 1 to 100, what is the percentage of local produce from upstate New York that gets to this city? Do you have an idea? I'll tell you, it's 2%. Okay, that's the impact that Walmart can have. All right. So I'm very interested these days. To me, best practice at a corporation is really what are they doing philanthropically? If they have a reason to do cause-related marketing, fine, do it well and with sincerity. And number 3, most importantly, what are you doing to embed really good social responsibility into your business practices?
All right. Thank you very much, Doug, Jack. I just want to point out as well that this session is being taped, as our other symposia have been over the years, and you can find them on our website, the BBB's website. All of today's program will be taped as well, and there's a white paper, so we'll be able to capture some of this very, very enlightening conversation, engaging conversation. I can't wait to see the social network conversation continue and take place. And the point that you just made, Doug, about the corporate side, again, many of you know the BBB also looks at that as a separate session in May, where we really talk to corporations about that responsibility. So, okay, we have a break right now. We'll be back in our seats here at 9:30 promptly because we have another session starting. So there's refreshments outside. Anyone interested in the Wise Giving Alliance information, and again, thanks, Bennett, for being here. One session with Justin, and then one room for networking. See you very soon.